The wind carried more than dust that morning. It carried the sound of a choice that would change a life. They called her Barren, and for that, her own kin sold her away as though she were nothing. But one man, a lonely lumberjack with 4 children, and a heart still scarred by loss, saw more than her empty womb. He saw a chance for home, though neither of them yet knew it. From shame and betrayal would rise a bond no gossip could shatter. No storm could drown, no hunger could break. This is the story of Mabel and Silas, how a woman sold as useless became the very root of a family, and how that family's love left a mark on the land itself. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. The little town at the edge of the timber country woke slowly that day. A thin layer of frost clung to wagon wheels and rail fences, the air so brittle it seemed like a word too loud could crack it. Mabel kept her eyes on the packed dirt beneath her shoes, though she knew full well folks were staring. Whispers slid through the crowd like wind through pine needles. She's the one. Can't bear children, not fit for a home. Sold by her own kin, no less. Lord help her. Each murmur felt like a pebble thrown at her back. She wanted to vanish, but there was no vanishing here. Her father had led her by the wrist like a parcel to be handed off, his grip hard and cold as iron. He never looked her in the eye. Not when he pushed her forward. Not when he named the price. $5. That was what she had been worth to him. Mabel swallowed hard, keeping her chin level even as shame scorched her. She told herself she would not cry in front of these people. Tears were wasted on the likes of them. On the other side of the square stood Silas Holt, a man built broad as the trees he felled. His beard was dark and untrimmed, his hands nicked with old scars from axe handles and saw teeth. He was a lumberjack, a widower, and a father to 4 children who clung to him like shadows. Folks said his wife had died in the last harsh winter, fever taking her before the thaw. Silas did not care for town gossip. He cared for keeping his children fed, for hauling logs downriver, for surviving one day at a time. Yet when he saw Mabel standing alone, thin shoulders trembling, eyes cast downward, something in him shifted like a log cracking in fire. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp as a crow's call. Here she is, healthy enough, quiet, can keep house, sold by her parents, for no fault but barrenness. The word hit the air like a slap. Barrenness. Folks nodded, some smirked. To them, a woman without children was a broken tool, a pot with no bottom. Silas's jaw tightened. He looked down at his children, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. His oldest boy, Thomas, barely 12, met his gaze with a question in his eyes. His youngest, little Clara, only 5, wrapped her small hand around his boot, as though afraid he'd vanish if she let go. Silas lifted a hand. I'll take her. The crowd turned, a low ripple of shock moving through it. The auctioneer blinked. You, Holt? She's not... I said I'll take her. His voice left no room for quarrel, and just like that, the matter was done. $5 passed from his calloused hand, and Mabel's life was altered forever. The wagon ride out of town was quiet. Silas held the reins steady while his children crowded the bench beside him. Mabel sat apart in the back, her thin hands clutching her shawl against the cold. The forest loomed ahead, towering pines, their tops lost in gray sky. The sound of the wagon wheels crunching frost seemed the only thing alive. Mabel stole a glance at her new husband. He hadn't spoken to her, not even once, since the square. His face was carved in lines of grief and fatigue, eyes focused forward as though looking too long at her might splinter him. She wondered if he despised her already, if she were always a reminder of what she could not give. The children peeked at her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Thomas sat stiff, protective of his siblings. Beside him, 11-year-old Ruth clutched a rag doll tight to her chest. 8-year-old Henry kept sneaking glances, his lips pressed thin, while Clara simply stared with wide, unblinking eyes. When the wagon rattled over a rut, Clara lost her grip on a small wooden horse she carried. It tumbled into the straw at Mabel's feet. Mabel bent down slowly, picked it up, and brushed off the dirt. She held it out, her hand trembling just a little. Clara hesitated, then reached forward and took it, her tiny fingers brushing Mabel's. For a moment, their eyes met, uncertain, searching. Something small but undeniable passed between them. By the time the wagon reached the Holt homestead, dusk had bled into the trees. The cabin was sturdy but weathered, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Piles of split logs leaned against the walls, and beyond stretched acres of stumps and standing forest, the scars of Silas's trade. Silas halted the team and set the brake. He turned at last to Mabel. His voice was low, even. "It's not much, but it's home. You'll sleep by the hearth until we sort things properly." She nodded, too weary to speak. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. The fire cast long shadows across rough-hewn walls. Mabel stood still, clutching her shawl as the children scattered to their corners. Silas set his axe against the doorframe, then met her eyes at last. "I didn't bring you here for pity," he said. "I brought you because these children need someone, and because I reckon you deserve more than what was given you in that square." Mabel's throat tightened. For the first time that day, she felt the faintest flicker of warmth, not from the fire, but from the chance, however fragile, that this place could be more than another prison. The wolves did not follow far, but their silence was worse than howls. The forest closed around the Holt homestead like a wall of shadows. Mabel lay awake that first night, wrapped in a thin quilt beside the hearth, listening to every creak of the cabin. The children's soft breaths rose and fell in the loft above, and Silas's heavy steps crossed the floor once, then stopped. For hours, she stared into the glow of the fire, wondering if she had traded one cage for another. She could still hear her mother's voice, cold and sharp. "You're no use to us, Mabel. A woman who can't bring life into the world may as well be dead weight." Her fingers curled into the quilt. That voice followed her even here, miles away. At dawn, Silas stoked the fire and handed her a tin cup of steaming chicory. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, his beard rough with frost. "Long days here," he said simply. "You'll see soon enough." Mabel nodded, grateful for the warmth in her hands. No more was said. The day began with chores. Silas carried buckets to the trough, swung an axe through pine logs, and mended a gate half hanging on its hinges. The children fell into patterns of duty, quick and practiced. Thomas chopping kindling, Ruth sweeping, Henry gathering eggs from the lean-to, Clara trailing close behind her siblings. Mabel moved quietly among them, unsure where to fit. She tried sweeping the floor, but Ruth bristled. "I already did that." She tried fetching wood, but Thomas scowled. "Pa says I handle that." Even Henry frowned when she reached for the egg basket. "They'll break if you touch 'em. Mabel's." Heart sank. She set her hands in her lap and stayed silent. Silas saw it, though he said nothing. His eyes flickered once in her direction, then back to his work. By midday, the stew pot bubbled weakly over the fire. Mabel offered to cut vegetables, and this time Silas nodded. She worked carefully, grateful for the task, and when Ruth wrinkled her nose at the stew, Silas's voice cut firm. "Eat. She cooked it. It'll keep you." It was not praise, not yet, but it was something. That night, frost crept thick across the windows. Clara woke coughing, a harsh sound that rattled her small chest. Mabel sat up fast, her heart thudding. She crossed to the loft ladder, hesitated, then climbed. Clara lay curled beneath a thin blanket, her cheeks fever-hot. The other children stirred, confused. Mabel pressed a hand to the little girl's brow, then looked down toward Silas. He was already awake, standing in the firelight, face drawn. "She burns with fever," Mabel whispered. Silas came up the ladder. his weight making it groan. He knelt by Clara, jaw tight. "I've lost one to sickness already," he muttered, so low Mabel barely heard. Mabel swallowed hard. "I know herbs. My mother taught me. Before she didn't finish. There's willow bark and onion if you've any." Silas's eyes locked on hers, searching. For the first time, she felt he truly looked at her. "Do what you can," he said. The night stretched long. Mabel boiled willow bark in a small kettle, coaxed Clara to sip the bitter brew, wrapped onions in cloths warmed by the fire, and laid them across her chest. She hummed softly, an old lullaby she'd half forgotten, while Silas stood watch like a sentinel carved from stone. Clara whimpered once, then settled. Sweat broke on her forehead. By dawn, her breathing eased. When the first pale light seeped into the cabin, Clara's small hand reached out, not for Silas, but for Mabel. Mabel took it gently, tears stinging her eyes. Silas watched, a shadow passing from his face. Something in his shoulders eased, just a little. The days that followed carried whispers of change. Ruth no longer snapped when Mabel touched the broom. Henry let her carry the egg basket without protest. Even Thomas, stiff and protective, glanced less sharply in her direction. Silas remained quiet, always working, always watching. But when Mabel passed him the stew pot one evening, their fingers brushed. He did not pull away. For Mabel, every moment felt fragile, like ice across a river. Thin, dangerous, but holding. She did not know if it would last, but for the first time in her life, she dared to hope. The sky darkened, though no storm yet broke. Life in timber country was measured by labor. Each sunrise meant another battle against the land, another chance to hold the cabin together. Mabel rose before the children, stoked the hearth, and kneaded dough with raw, cracked hands. She told herself routine would shield her from the whispers still echoing in her mind. But the forest had a way of pressing silence into every thought, and silence often turned cruel. When the family finally ventured into town for supplies, that silence was shattered. The main street buzzed with wagons, horses tied to hitching posts, and men in worn coats spitting tobacco by the saloon doors. Mabel drew her shawl close, hoping to be invisible, but she wasn't. She never was. It began with a voice, sharp as a knife. "Well, I'll be. If it isn't Mabel Fletcher." Her stomach twisted. She knew the voice. Ruth Fletcher, her former sister-in-law. Tall, with a smile that was more sneer than kindness, Ruth wasted no time making sure the crowd heard. So it's true. Sold off like a mule, and look who picked. "Her up! Holt, the lumberjack! Didn't think you'd stoop to buying what another man tossed aside." Laughter rippled through the street. Mabel froze, heat burning up her neck. She wanted to disappear into the dirt, but her feet held her there, trembling. Silas stepped forward. His shadow fell long across the street. "That'll do." Ruth arched a brow. "Touchy, are we? I'm only speaking what everyone knows." "Barren," they said. "Good for cooking maybe, but no more. You'll see soon enough, Holt. She won't give you anything." The children stiffened. Thomas's fists clenched. Ruth Holt lowered her head. Henry looked ready to spit fire, and little Clara clung to Silas's coat. Silas's voice cut like an axe splitting wood. "I said that'll do." The laughter died. The street went still. His eyes locked on Ruth Fletcher's with a steadiness that carried no threat, only truth. "This woman keeps my house, tends my children, and works through the night to see one live who might have died. That's more than most around here can say for themselves." The words landed heavily. No one laughed now. Ruth Fletcher's face tightened, her mouth pressed thin. She turned on her heel with a mutter and vanished into the crowd. Mabel stood frozen, tears pricking her eyes. She hadn't asked for defense, had never expected it. Yet Silas had spoken plain before all of them, claiming her worth in a way no one ever had. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "Thank you." Silas only gave a curt nod, as though it needed no thanks. The return home was quiet. Mabel busied herself with putting away supplies, her hands trembling as she stacked jars and folded flour sacks. She wanted to speak, to tell Silas what it meant to her, but words snagged in her throat. Later, while the children dozed, Silas sat sharpening his axe by the fire. The steel caught the glow, flashing bright with each stroke of the whetstone. Mabel sat across from him, sewing a torn sleeve. The silence between them was not heavy now. It was something else. Something waiting. At last, she said softly, "I thought I'd live and die being told I was useless." She kept her eyes on the cloth, afraid to meet his. You shamed them instead." The whetstone paused. Silas looked up, his gaze steady. They were wrong. Her breath caught. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of fire. Then, from the loft above, Clara's small voice broke the quiet. "Mama?" Mabel froze. The needle slipped from her fingers. Slowly, she looked up toward the loft. Clara was half asleep. Her curls tangled, her eyes heavy. "Mama," the child mumbled again before drifting back into slumber. Silas set the axe down. His eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. Mabel pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling hot. It was a word she thought she would never hear. And though it came from the smallest voice in the house, it rang louder than all the jeers in town. Night fell like a hammer, and with it came trouble. The days after Clara's whispered "Mama" should have been brighter, but peace rarely lasted in timber country. Mabel began to feel the slow thaw of acceptance. Thomas no longer glared. Quite so sharply, Ruth sometimes hummed with her while sweeping, and Henry laughed when she scolded him for tracking mud across the floor. Yet with every step forward, the world seemed determined to drag her 2 steps back. It was on a Saturday evening, after a long week of hauling lumber and mending fences, that Silas went to check the line of traps near the creek. Mabel stayed, behind, to tend supper. The children were inside, the pot bubbling, when a hard knock rattled the cabin door. Mabel stiffened. She opened it just enough to see the figure swaying on the threshold. Jedediah Cray, neighbor in name, drunkard in truth. His shirt hung open, his beard stank of whiskey, and his eyes carried the wild gleam of a man long past sober sense. "Well, ain't this something?" he slurred. "Silas gone off, and you here all alone." Mabel's heart leapt into her throat. She gripped the door tight. "Go home, Mr. Cray. You've had enough." But Jedediah shoved a boot against the frame. "Don't play proud. Everyone knows what you are. Barren. Sold off like a lame mare. A woman like you ought to be grateful for any company." The words struck hard, sharper than the shove of his hand as he pushed the door wider. The children gasped inside. Thomas stood, fists clenched, ready to fight, though he was only a boy. Mabel raised her voice, steady despite her fear. "Back away, or I'll—" "You'll what?" Jedediah sneered, reaching, and then he was yanked backward so fast the breath left his chest in a grunt. Silas had returned. The lumberjack's hands clamped like iron on Jedediah's collar, spinning him into the dirt outside. The children crowded. At the door, wide-eyed as their father loomed above the intruder. Jedediah staggered to his feet, spitting mud. "Holt, she's nothing but a—" The fist came hard and fast. Silas's knuckles cracked against his jaw, dropping him like a felled log. "You come near this house again," Silas growled, his voice low and dangerous, "and I'll bury you where you stand." Jedediah scrambled, clutching his bleeding mouth. He muttered curses, but fear drove him stumbling into the trees, swallowed by the dark. Silas stood in the yard, chest heaving. The night pressed heavily, the only sound the fading crash of Jedediah's flight. When he turned, his eyes met Mabel's. They were dark with fury still. But behind the fury was something else, Fear. Not fear for himself, but for her. Inside, silence ruled. The children looked from their father to Mabel, waiting. Silas wiped his hand on his trousers, then spoke. "No one lays a hand or insult on this house, not while I draw breath." His words hung thick in the cabin. Then he turned to Mabel. His voice softened, just enough for her to hear it as something more than a command. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, throat tight. "No." For a moment, neither moved. Then Clara slipped, her small hand into Mabel's, holding fast. Mabel felt her knees weaken. She had been sold as less than human, branded as useless. Yet here, with a child's hand in hers and Silas's eyes burning steady, she felt something rise in her chest, something fierce, not fear, belonging. That night, after the children slept, Mabel sat by the fire with trembling hands. Silas sat, across from her, knuckles raw, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," she whispered. His gaze lifted. "They're not your battles alone." She drew a shaky breath. "Why do you defend me? Everyone says I'm—" "Everyone." Talks too much. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "A family ain't measured by what's born. It's measured by who stays. And you stayed when Clara burned with fever. You stayed when that town spat its poison. That's worth more than womb or gossip." Her heart ached at the plainness of his words. For years, she had longed to hear just one soul say she was not broken. And now, in the glow of the hearth, she finally had. She lowered her head, tears glistening. "Then I'll keep staying." Silas said nothing more. But when the fire crackled and his hand brushed against hers on the bench, he did not move it away. The river swelled with spring thaw, and with it came danger. The thaw brought more than mud and rushing water. It brought work that tested every hand in the Holt household. Silas hauled timber downstream with Thomas at his side, while Ruth and Henry tended the hens and kept Clara near. Mabel shouldered her share, splitting kindling, patching clothes, and keeping stew stretched thin over too many mouths. It was on one of those long days that calamity struck. Henry, bold and restless, had taken it upon himself to climb the old barn loft where Silas stored spare planks. Mabel was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard the crack, a board giving way, a boy's startled cry, then the sickening thud. Her heart froze. She ran, skirts tangling, to find Henry crumpled in. The dust. His leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. His face was white, his lips quivering. "Mama," he gasped, the words slipping out without thought. Mabel dropped to her knees. Her hands shook as she felt along his leg, the wrong angle telling her what she already knew. Broken, the other children. Screamed for Silas, but he was still half a mile downriver. Mabel's breath came fast, her mother's old teachings rising in fragments. "Splint, bind, keep still. Ruth, fetch strong sticks. Thomas, tear a strip from that flour sack. Clara, bring water. Now." Her voice cracked sharply. No room for doubt. The children obeyed, wide-eyed. Mabel steadied Henry's leg, whispering, "I've got you, sweetheart. Stay with me." She pressed her shawl beneath his head, her own body trembling though her hands worked steadily. With the sticks and cloth, she splinted the limb, tightening until Henry cried out. She hushed him, brushing sweat from his brow. By the time Silas thundered into the yard, breathless, Mabel had the boy's leg bound firm. "What happened?" he barked. Mabel lifted her chin. "He fell from the loft. The leg's broken, but I've splinted it. He'll need rest and willow." Bark for the pain. Silas dropped to his knees beside his son, eyes fierce and afraid. Henry clung to Mabel's hand, not his father's. She knew what to do, Thomas whispered, awe softening his usual defiance. Silas's gaze flicked from his son to Mabel. In that moment, gratitude warred with something deeper. Recognition. "You saved him," he said, voice rough. Mabel shook her head. "I only did what had to be done." But inside, her heart thundered. For once, she had not been powerless. That night. The cabin was quiet, but for Henry's shallow breathing. Mabel sat by his bedside, cool cloth pressed to his forehead. The boy slept fitfully, whimpering now and again, and each time her hand soothed his curls until he stilled. Silas stood in the doorway, arms folded. The firelight caught the weariness in his face. The weight of too many burdens carried too long. "You stayed up all night with Clara when she burned," he said quietly. "Now you sit up with Henry." Mabel looked down at the boy, her voice soft. "They need someone. And I need them." Silas stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. For a moment, the silence between them brimmed with all the words unsaid. Finally, he exhaled. "You're free to go, Mabel." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. He crouched low, his voice steady though it trembled at the edges. "I bought you, yes, but I'll never chain you. You're not bound here, not like folks whisper. If you want to leave, no one will stop you. Not even me." Mabel's throat closed. The choice, so long denied her, now lay open before her. Freedom. Yet the thought of walking away from this cabin, from these children who called her Mama, tore through her like fire. She looked at Silas, his face raw and unguarded. "And if I stay?" His jaw worked, but he did not answer. Mabel reached for Henry's hand, held it tight. Her voice broke, but it carried truth. "Then I stay because I choose to." The sun baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. The drought came early that summer. Grass withered in the pasture, the hens pecked at dust, and the Holt garden shriveled into brittle stalks. Every day Silas returned from the river with buckets half empty, his face carved with worry. The children grew quieter at supper, counting bites instead of laughing. Mabel rose before dawn, hauling water with Ruth and Clara at her side, but the ground swallowed it greedily. By noon, her dress clung with sweat and her hands blistered on the hoe. Yet she refused to stop. She could not stop. Each dry furrow reminded her of what her parents had said, that she was barren, useless, a curse. She would not let the earth prove them right. "Life can grow here," she whispered, though no one heard. It must. Silas watched from the porch, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of failure. He had felled trees taller than houses, hauled timber through storms, and fought men twice his size. But against the sky's refusal to rain, he was helpless. Mabel knelt in the soil, dirt streaking her cheeks. Her hands pressed seeds into the earth with the care of a mother laying a child to bed. Silas felt something twist in his chest. She was not barren, not here, not in the ways that mattered. That night, when the others slept, he found her still in the garden, whispering prayers into the soil. "You'll wear yourself to the bone," he said. She looked up, firelight flickering in her eyes. "If the Lord sends no rain, then we'll find water another way. I won't watch these children starve." Silas knelt beside her, wordless. Together they pressed their hands into the dirt. Weeks passed. Small shoots began to rise, stubborn, against the odds. Beans, peas, a row of onions, green where there should have been nothing. The children marveled, Clara dancing barefoot between the rows. "You brought it back," Ruth whispered to Mabel, awe in her voice. Mabel smiled, though tears stung her eyes. "No, we all did. We chose to fight for it. Even Thomas, who guarded, his heart like a soldier, bent down to touch the new leaves." "Looks like it'll hold," Silas's voice came from behind, quiet but steady. "Because of her." Mabel turned, startled. His eyes held hers, no longer guarded. For the first time, she felt the wall between them crumble. but not all welcomed their resilience. One evening, word came that Ruth Fletcher, the bitter sister-in-law, had been whispering again in town. Tales of Mabel's barrenness, twisted, now with venom, that the Holts were cursed, that their land would fail because they'd taken her in. Silas slammed his fist on the table, rattling dishes. Enough of her poison! Mabel's stomach knotted. She had lived her whole life under such words, but now, with the children's wide eyes watching, she felt something fierce stir inside. Let them talk, she said firmly. This house knows the truth. These children know it, and that matters more than any gossip. Her words silenced, even Silas. He stared at her with something like awe. That night, Clara crawled into Mabel's lap by the fire. "Mama," she whispered, resting her head against her. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." Mabel's throat closed. She rocked the child gently, tears slipping free. For so long, she had believed she had nothing to give. Yet here was proof, warm and breathing in her arms, that she had given more than she ever dreamed. Across the fire, Silas watched. His eyes softened, and for once the hardness of grief gave way to something else. Something that looked very much like hope. The past returned not with warning, but with dust on its boots. The drought's grip had loosened just enough for the garden to green, and the Holt cabin breathed easier with every sprout that climbed skyward. But one afternoon, as the sun leaned low, a rider appeared on the horizon. Mabel knew the gait of that horse before she even saw the face. Her breath caught in her chest. It was Elias Fletcher, her former husband. He swung down from his saddle in the yard as though he still had a claim, his slick hair and polished boots out of place in the rough clearing. His eyes, sharp with pride, raked over the cabin, the children, and finally, Mabel. "Well," he said with a smirk, "they said you were here. I almost didn't believe it. My wife, living like a drudge in the wilderness." Mabel's hands went cold. "You forfeited the right to call me wife the day you let your kin sell me." Elias laughed, low and cruel. "I let them. You were useless. I only did what was merciful. And now look at you, playing mother to bastards that aren't yours." Thomas bristled, stepping forward, but Silas's hand clamped down on his shoulder. The boy stilled, his jaw tight. Silas stepped out from the doorway, his axe still in hand from the woodpile. His eyes burned with steady fire. "You've said enough." Elias sneered. "You think she belongs to you, Holt? Papers say otherwise. Her name's still Fletcher. She's mine to claim if I choose." The words struck like a lash. Mabel's chest heaved. She had no papers, no proof, nothing but the fragile life she'd built in this cabin. But Silas did, not flinch. He planted his feet, his voice like stone. "She's not yours, not in law, not in spirit. She's free to walk, and she stays because she chooses. You'll not change that." Elias's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching near the revolver at his hip. The air thickened, and the children huddled at the door. For a heartbeat, the whole world hung in a thread. Then Mabel stepped forward. Her voice, though trembling, carried clearly. "I would rather live in this cabin with hungry mouths and dirt on my hands than spend one more day as your possession. I am not your wife, and I never will be again." Elias's face hardened. He spat into the dust. "You'll regret that." With a sharp tug on the reins, he mounted and turned, galloping back toward town, leaving only dust in his wake. Silas's hand brushed Mabel's arm, steadying her. "You did right," he said quietly. But Mabel's knees weakened beneath her. The past had found her, had spat its venom once more, and though she had stood tall, fear coiled deep. That night, she sat by the fire, trembling. Silas placed a mug of warm broth in her hands. His voice was low. "He can't take you, not while I live." Mabel looked at him, tears streaking her face. "And if something happens to you?" He leaned closer, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Then these children will still call you Mama, and that will never be taken away." The words settled into her bones, strong as iron. For the first time since she had been sold, she no longer felt owned. She felt chosen. Outside, the night pressed close. Somewhere in town, Ruth Fletcher and her kin no doubt plotted. Their pride stung. Trouble would come again. But in that cabin, Mabel sat surrounded by children who clung to her skirts and a man whose steady hand had silenced every whisper. Whatever storm lay ahead, she knew now she would not face it alone. The showdown came not with thunder, but with footsteps on dry earth. The day Elias Fletcher returned for the last time, the air was brittle with heat. Dust rose from the road as he rode with 2 men at his side. Kin or hired hands, it mattered little. Their eyes carried the same hunger for dominance, the same need to prove Mabel still belonged to them. Silas stood in the yard, axe in one hand, shotgun leaned against the porch rail. His children pressed behind the door. Mabel stepped outside beside him, her palms sweating but her back straight. Elias reined in, his sneer sharp as ever. "Last chance, Holt. She walks away with me, and this ends quietly. Refuse, and the land suffers with you." Silas's voice rolled low, steady as riverstone. "This land's marked, not for sale, not for claim, and neither is she." Elias laughed, but the sound rang hollow. He dismounted, boots crunching on dry soil, hand sliding toward his revolver. Mabel's heart thundered. She remembered the shame, the auction, the jeers. But she also remembered Clara whispering, "Mama," Henry's broken leg in her arms, the garden sprouting against all odds. She would not be silent. "She is not for sale," she said, her voice rising strong. "I am not Barren. I am not useless. I am their mother, his wife, and I belong here because I choose it." The men shifted uneasily. Elias's jaw clenched. He pulled his revolver, but Silas was faster. The shotgun boomed, the blast tearing into the dirt inches from Elias's boots. The crack echoed through the valley like judgment itself. Elias staggered back, face pale. For once, words failed him. With a curse, he scrambled onto his horse. His companions followed. Dust swallowed them whole as they fled, leaving only silence behind. The children spilled into the yard, clinging to Mabel and Silas. Thomas's eyes gleamed with pride. Ruth sobbed into Mabel's skirts. Henry grinned through his limp, and Clara whispered, "Mama, we're safe." Silas laid the shotgun aside and pulled them all close. For a long moment, the family stood together beneath the wide western sky, the past finally behind them. Seasons passed. The drought broke, the garden grew strong, green shoots turning to harvest. Mabel became the heart of the Holt home. Her hands coaxed life from soil, her voice steadied every fear, her presence filled the empty places grief had carved. When Silas carved a sign to mark their gate, he pressed the words deep into oak, "Not for sale." Years later, when both he and Mabel rested beneath the same soil they had worked, the cabin still stood. The garden bloomed each spring, and folks said the Holt land was never touched by buyers, for everyone knew it was rooted in something money could not buy: chosen love, fierce devotion, and the strength of a woman once cast aside. This story, they whispered, made history. If you believe in love that grows where others swore nothing could, in families built not by blood but by choice, then this tale belongs to you too. Ride with us again. Subscribe, share this story, and keep the spirit of the frontier alive.